Okay, super. So thank you so much for the invitation, and yeah, it's really, really nice to be here digitally. Hopefully next year or the next time we can meet in person. I've been to Bremen once, and yeah, I mean the area in general is nice. So I'd like to come back for sure. So what I want to present today is two things. The first is basically an overview of my recently accepted JFQA, and this is kind of not much to do specifically with Robo-Advice. And then I want to talk a little bit about some things that we're planning currently. We were already supposed to be in market, but plans change, and now we are rethinking and revising our strategy for what we want to do as basically a follow-up to this study, which kind of starts to bring in Robo-Advice. Now, so I think this is a great topic and a great setting to present this kind of work in progress, as well as some of our findings and learnings from our first study. And throughout, if anyone has questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt, and hopefully we have some time at the end to chat about what you might think and how I can improve our study going forward. Okay, so the first bit I want to present. So first of all, both of these, everything I'm going to present is co-authored with Di Bu and Yin Lao, who are at Macquarie University. The first paper also has Yong Liu as a co-author from Wuhan. Okay, so the first paper is basically called Cultivating Self-Control in FinTech, Evidence from a Field Experiment on Online Consumer Borrowing. So let me just start kind of motivating this stuff with some very interesting stylized facts about the digital setting in China. So I like this quote very much. While America spent the past decade upgrading its bank-based magnetic strip card with chips, China experienced a retail payment revolution, leapfrogging the card-based system with two new payment systems. These systems dominate P2P retail and business transactions. The new systems are built on digital wallets, QR codes, and they run through their own tech firms. So Alipay runs through Alibaba, which is China's version of Amazon, and WeChat Pay runs through Tencent, so China's version of Facebook. What you see here are some pictures from, I didn't take these, but they were my co-authors who are from China and based in Australia these days, kind of pass these on as examples of how people are paying for things on the street using their mobile phones, paying via QR codes. Here you see a homeless person who's asking for kind of a donation with cash, but also with a QR code, so you could transfer him something from WeChat Pay directly from your phones. So, it goes kind of without saying that advances in technology have basically transformed the way that individuals make purchases and also access credit and debt. The benefits to widespread access to credit and kind of payment availability is obvious, but there are also some costs, right? So, looking at China, across the two major platforms, which is Alipay and WeChat, mobile payment transactions totaled over $41 trillion in 2018, and 90% of mobile payments occurred across these two platforms, which each have over 1 billion users, which is mind-boggling, to say the least. Outstanding consumer loans grew by 40% from 2017 to 2018, while online lending is kind of the channel that was one of the most rapidly growing. And that's kind of the segment we're going to focus on today. Some industry statistics suggest that more than 25% of all individuals in China under the age of 30 have a Ant Check Later, which is the micro lending account by Alibaba. There's a typo here, but this should say, I think it's 53% of college students had used online loans for purchasing products such as kind of, digital or computing equipment. These students also spend a large fraction of their income devoted to debt repayment, and more than 50% of students who had used the online lending platforms suggested that the monthly loan repayments significantly impacted their daily lives. Let me kind of explain the setting a little bit. So as opposed to consumer credit cards and kind of traditional sources of bank financing, e-commerce platforms such as Alibaba and JD.net, these are the largest online portals in China. You can think about them as basically as Amazon. So these portals do not require individuals to have some sort of established credit score. They don't require proof of employment. They don't require that their customers have some sort of regular income in order for them to provide sources of credit to these clients. So they target a previously underserved markets. These are students and young adults who are traditionally basically constrained and kept out of the traditional sources of finance from banks, for example, because they don't have employment, they don't have an established credit card, and they don't generally have a regular income. These online portals determine loan eligibility across their customers using their own online data. So the digital footprint that customers make online, are the basis for the credit rating profiles, and in turn, how much credit they would have access to and at what rates. These tech companies have a very different regulatory regime compared to traditional financial institutions in China. So these online portals can basically offer credit at point of sale, which varies from less than $100 to $70,000, and this is all based on the analysis of individuals' purchase history and their kind of payment history and their account data. The account data spans across their network of sites and products, right? So we're not only talking about Amazon, but you have to also imagine that Amazon also controlled 90% of mobile payments in Germany or the United States. They would also use that data to see who you are paying to, when you are making payments, and how much, and so on and so forth, to feed their kind of loan eligibility algorithms. This type of credit is not new, right? So you can think about it essentially as an installment credit. Or consumer credit. In the U.S. or in research, we tend to think of these types of products as somewhat predatory. They generally have a low interest rate or kind of zero interest rate for some time period, and then kind of a balloon payment. You can also argue that they serve a segment of the market which could benefit from being constrained at certain times. These individuals with such products can better smooth credit, and their welfare increasing. However, typically this is not the view taken by regulators and customers and policymakers and so on and so forth. Basically, here's the Wall Street Journal talking about these products in China. So Jack Ma's Ant, so Ant is the institution, the $7 credit limit. Basically, what we're talking about here generally are micro lending. And these online consumer financing has grown, here's a kind of a crazy statistic because the market didn't really exist in 2014, but by 2020, it's an $8 trillion dollar market, basically. So a significant increase since they've been around. Also, even the Wall Street Journal suggests that hundreds of millions of borrowers, are taking on these tiny loans. So any comments or questions so far? Feel free to interrupt, as I suggested. So here what we see is just a screenshot from one of the portal sites where individuals can buy a MacBook Pro, and they have kind of directly the ability to finance it based on these micro lending products, which of course for a MacBook Pro is significantly larger than a $7 micro loan. So basically, in our first study, we referenced that there's really a large literature trying to understand what skills are associated with financial literacy and how these types of financial literacy interventions affect savings and borrowing decisions. There's a lot of mixed findings here. Much of the literature suggests that improving individuals' financial literacy doesn't really translate into improved downstream behavior. A number of studies find that it does, but it's very much a mixed field here. And even more recently, studies have examined how skills that are outside of traditional financial literacy, so outside of the kind of quantitative financial literacy topics, may be linked to financial behavior, things as efficacy and self-ability and self-control. So we came to the table and said, well, there's actually limited evidence if these kind of non-cognitive skills such as self-control, different types of budgeting decisions, and so on and so forth can be trained or manipulated by kind of interventions. And we know relatively little about how these types of skills, actually both financial literacy and kind of non-cognitive skills, how these types of skills work with new financial technology or new financial products, such as the debt product, which we study here. And, kind of there's lots of policy calls in general in China, first of all, to address growing consumer debt. This kind of influx or massive balloon growth in consumer debt, not only online, but through installment credit, through mortgages, through general consumer debt, is basically new to the last generation or two. Most studies show that basically all of this growth in consumer debt is driven by basically newer consumers, not the older kind of generations, which have had historically been much more debt averse. And also on top of policy calls to basically integrate financial literacy into a broad scale. So basically making financial literacy, which is something that is widespread to students and to adults and to kind of integrated into traditional sources of curriculum. So what we do basically in the first study is it's a longitudinal intervention with students across 5 different universities in China, and spanned basically 2016 to 2019. What we did was examine the uptake of online consumer credit before and after kind of financial education or financial literacy training, more kind of standardized and more traditional, as well as kind of self-control training. And I'll talk about these interventions in a bit. Basically, our main hypothesis is that in the era of fintech, when kind of when consumption and borrowing behavior is now online and at the ease of a button, lack of self-control and budgeting skills and some of these non-traditional financial literacy elements are potentially more important determinants of this type of behavior. Okay, so the paper contributes to a number of fields. The first is this kind of established literature, which links financial literacy and household financial decision-making. This field has kind of, talked about non-cognitive skills and generally thought about self-control and financial distress and this type of thing, and how, these non-cognitive skills map to kind of poor financial outcomes or financial decisions. There's also a very large literature, of course, on financial education, interventions, and future behavior. Fernandez and co-authors have a nice summary of the paper they call this manipulated financial literacy. In general, they argue that these types of interventions have not enough or no real effect on downstream behavior. I think Anna Maria Lusardi has a more recent survey of the literature where she argues the opposite direction. She says, no, these things actually do affect behavior, but again, this is still kind of debatable. Yeah, these kind of research and policy topics I already talked a little bit about. Yeah, so we also contribute generally to this literature on consumer credit and payday lending. I mean, payday lending is obviously, a different vehicle than the one we're talking about, but we argue that some of the behavioral aspects of why people take on debt could be similar. And then obviously this growing literature between households and individuals and how they use and perceive financial technology, which is kind of very broad. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the intervention and the sample. So we started with a baseline survey across second-year university students across 5 universities. We basically had about 1,800 total in our subject pool. And the way that we sampled them was we basically hired student volunteers, so to say, from the universities in Wuhan, which would go around basically across the student dormitories and invite specific rooms. Each room contains 3 students, more or less. It's like more than one, more like a small apartment. And we would invite the entire room into our study. And then when we invite the room, one of the individuals would be randomly allocated to the treatment, and the other to a different treatment, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But we ended up with about 1,800 across these different universities. And then we basically first invited them for the baseline survey, which asked questions on financial literacy, spending and borrowing behavior. And kind of our one main important question is how often do you borrow, and how much do you borrow, and how frequently do you borrow, using some of these online sources of credit, which I kind of described earlier. The interventions were basically that there was a second random assignment of students into either the what we call the placebo financial literacy treatment or into the self-control treatment. And then after these interventions was another follow-up survey. We could revisit these students with a 95% follow-up rate, and followed up with a similar kind of set of questions on financial behavior, borrowing behavior, and financial literacy. I mean, considering that the follow-up survey was 2.5 years apart from the baseline survey, being able to observe 95% of the same respondents was pretty impressive for us. Yeah, so here you see is just a kind of a simple timeline. So we have survey 1 in November 2016, and then the 2 groups are split up from financial literacy, self-control, and a zero-touch control group. In the financial literacy program, there's essentially 3 classes over this horizon, over the course of 2017, where they learn different kind of standardized topics through the financial literacy. I mean, much of this comes from essentially the generic financial literacy training programs, which are already in place in China. China's the government is basically, has policy calls and supporting financially any initiatives to integrate financial literacy into schooling and university education programs. So this is why we basically refer to it as a placebo treatment, because it's really, it's nothing crazy, but it's just bringing this into a segmented class. A self-control treatment, on the other hand, is slightly different. Basically, what we do is, rather than focus specifically on these financial literacy topics, there were 3 classes where individuals focus on training, let's say, softer skills related to financial education. So, I think on the next slide, here's a better. Sorry, there's a lot of text here, but here's some more information about the specific training in the self-control treatment. Basically, we're motivated from a literature in psychology on self-regulation. The key references here are Baumeister and Carver and Shire, who basically argue that the three tenets of self-control training are goal setting, engaging in actions which lead to obtaining goals, and monitoring progress towards the goal. Oaten and Chan have a series of papers where they basically come up with a training program for things like smoking and weight loss and so on and so forth, which basically involves meeting in a group and with a kind of a counselor there and writing down your goals. Every time the group meets, you write your progress down towards these goals. And kind of after the goal phase, you basically evaluate how well you did, and so on and so forth. So basically, our idea was to bring this idea into the world of saving and consumption, savings and consumption, and how these kind of a training program related to personal finance would affect spending and borrowing decisions. So the one innovation to this is that we also had users use a mobile-based personal financial management app, which would allow them to kind of monitor and track spending decisions. I mean, tracking is hard to say in this setting, but let's say monitor actual spending decisions. And this is nice because it also gives us data about exactly what individuals did for purchasing and savings. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the self-control training aims to train kind of core concepts of borrowing and savings and eliminate barriers that agents may have in mapping abstract knowledge into concrete choices. So if you think about it, financial education in a standardized setting would explain things like compounding interest, the time value of money, and how much fees and interest rates you should be paying and thinking about, and planning ahead. But it's quite abstract in that sense. You're not actually writing down a financial plan and then observing your progress towards that thing. So that's basically what the self-control training was aimed to do. Lars, how much time do I have? Should I just go on for at least another half an hour, or is it?
Yes. So if you continue for half an hour more, then we would be perfect in time. But it's up to you. If you take 5 minutes longer or shorter, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then I'll just keep going. So I mean, I basically talked about our main hypothesis, but just to break it down, we wanted to understand if students are basically misinformed about borrowing and credit choices, then financial education would potentially improve their outcomes. If the online borrowing that they're doing is actually driven by potentially behavioral or impulsive factors, or kind of a lack of being able to budget and plan some of these kind of non-traditional financial literacy topics, then our self-control training should potentially show a different sort of effect on outcome borrowing decisions. So the first thing I want to show you is essentially, when we just looked at financial literacy outcomes, because this is something we also elicited in both waves of the survey, what we wanted to check was, did our financial literacy treatment affect outcomes in financial literacy? So we see that for the control group from wave 1 to wave 2, students in general slightly improved their financial literacy scores, which makes sense. I mean, you kind of accumulate some information over a 2.5-year period through university or whatever. Our subjects in the self-control treatment, very slightly improved their financial literacy score from wave 1 to 2. Recall in this self-control treatment, we didn't specifically teach topics directly related to financial literacy, but more kind of related to budgeting skills and planning and so on. The financial literacy was kind of very much geared at improving, individuals' knowledge about questions related to financial literacy, and we find that this had a significant impact. On average, people increased their score by 1 full point. And I believe the score is out of 6, so that was pretty substantial. When we look at how our treatments affected individuals' rates of borrowing, we find the following. So the unconditional difference in borrowing from pre to post by treatment. So essentially the control group increases the rate of borrowing significantly over time, and this kind of speaks to the growth in this market during our study. So, if you think about a traditional difference in difference, you might be concerned when the matched control changes behavior significantly over time. But this is exactly what we expected to find here. And so we found that the control group, if you think about it as a time series, increases borrowing significantly over the 2.5-year period. The financial literacy group, they increase borrowing as well, but less so compared to the control group. And our self-control treatment was really the only treatment that had 0 growth or even a negative growth. So they actually reduced the rate of online borrowing, over the course of our study. And this just shows kind of these values relative to the control group. So relative to the control group, those in the self-control study decreased the rate of borrowing by about 15%. And this is unconditional. When we throw in kind of different control variables, individual fixed effects, and kind of controls for things that we elicited in the survey, we find that, so in general, when we look at the financial literacy treatment relative to the control, there's no statistical decrease. The self-control on average is about 11 percentage points less than the control group.
Tobin, just one thing that pops my eye is like if I look at the table, and I know that if you run an experiment, you're probably more interested in identification and not so much about the degree of explainability. But I think in this chart, if you look at the R squared, it's very impressive to see it goes from 1% to 88%. By including controls that don't have a big effect and are insignificant. Can you explain that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really the most of the power is coming from the individual fixed effects. Yeah, so this is like when we look at the post behavior, it's very much important to consider what the pre behavior is as well for each individual. Yeah. So basically, this is in column 3 or in column 5, for example, this is just like a population average, and then when we look at individually, it shows that the people that have previous experience borrowing are the ones that decrease their borrowing, which is, I think, the right direction. I don't have the backup slide for that specific analysis in the slides, but it's in the paper. When you look, we break up this main result a number of different ways. I just wanted to give you an overview today, but if you look at those. If you look at the change in borrowing conditional on their their previous borrowing assistance, is precisely those that decrease. So the ones who borrowed before then go through the treatment are the ones that decrease. So there are people who didn't borrow before, and you could imagine they actually learn about the ability to borrow and then borrow potentially at a higher rate. So we find basically no effect for those who don't borrow previously. And I think that's the main explanation for the individual fixed effect. So when we look at gender as well, we also see some significant differences. It seems like men are the ones who are strongly benefiting from the self-control treatment relative to the control group, and females on average are also decreasing, but men are decreasing at twice the rate. I'm not going to spend too much time in the presentation, but in the paper we discuss a number of reasons why this could be, and it's mainly because pre-treatment, men and women have very different patterns in our setting in terms of borrowing and in terms of spending. So we see pre-treatment that men are spending mostly on entertainment-related consumption and video games, which is also kind of entertainment. But in China, we treat this as a whole separate bucket because that's what a lot of people are consuming, especially university students. So they are the ones who are actually able to adjust their borrowing behavior the most by reducing entertainment-based consumption. Women, on the other hand, in our setting, are much more likely to borrow for reasons that may be rational to borrow for. So things like education-related expense, eating, and things like that. So it's not perfect data, it's not perfect survey data either to really say that women are rationally borrowing and men are irrationally borrowing. That I don't want to say, but there is some evidence of different spending behavior pre-treatment and then post-treatment. It seems like there's heterogeneity in what people can decrease their borrowing for. There are a couple challenges to this design, right? So our main outcome variables currently are based on survey data. So students could lie, right? They could also forget when they borrowed or how much they borrowed. We have a relatively long time series, and subjects could in fact react to the fact that they're part of a study rather than the treatment themselves, right? So there's kind of this demand effect or Hawthorne effect. All of these challenges could introduce imprecision in our outcome variables. So basically, what we're measuring, the rate of borrowing. What we do then to overcome some of these limitations is use the actual PFM data that's part of the self-control intervention. So this is not perfect because we don't have a control group, so to say, but we have this pre and post within subject effect based on PFM data. And this allows us to investigate if kind of the sessions are accurate in terms of what they say and what they actually do, and gives us kind of an out of sample window, which is much longer than the treatment. Not much, but a little bit longer than the treatment, which would kind of limit any Hawthorne-related effects. So here are just some screenshots of different mobile-based PFMs that subjects in our study are using. Sorry for the Chinese and poor translations here. Basically, what we find on average, so the probability of borrowing online for those in the self-control study. So we can see that there's, after the third class, which is this third bar, first class, second bar, third bar, and, just because of some regulatory stuff about when we can measure data and how long we're allowed to use this data, this is basically our app data collection. This is our sample window. On class 1, they basically installed and set up the PFM, so we don't have data before that, and that data really only starts between class 1 and class 2. So we can see that the marginal effect on the probability of borrowing is negative on average, but over the time series, the decrease in borrowing really happens basically at the third class. So once the program is in a sense over. And then we observe we have a survey wave, kind of our second survey wave is here towards the end of the survey period. So one thing you will notice, right? So on average, the probability of borrowing decreases, but then relatively, picks back up again. So one finding here is regarding the probability of borrowing, these are relatively short-lived effects, right? So this kind of echoes Fernandez and co-authors in the management science who talk about this limited effect on downstream behavior, and at the same time their calls to action or their calls to policy are that what we need is actually not just these one-off interventions, but rather just-in-time interventions, so to say. So or kind of these ongoing curriculums or ongoing things which integrate with standard curriculums, so that individuals may be kind of constantly made salient or reminded about certain aspects of financial literacy. And that's what I would argue here as well. On average, overall, the amount borrowed decreases, and this kind of stays significantly less over time, even kind of after the study period, and same with the number of times borrowed. So, I mean, we do see some effect of longer term or medium term reductions from our PFM data. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it could be the case that subjects are actually completely aware of what they're doing. They're actually very financially literate, or they're very literate themselves, and know about the risks or the costs or the benefits related to short-term credit, and they may be perfectly well able to smooth these types of, or they use these products to smooth any types of income or consumption shocks. It may be completely rational if I'm a university student with currently zero income to borrow in order to get an iPad or whatever, because I know that I will have high income in the future. This is an investment in human capital. It's an investment in whatever, right? So the way we kind of shed some light on that is to look at late fees and the stress that individuals report that they have from kind of holding a credit balance or a negative balance. So what we see here is we can look at individuals or subjects who are unconstrained versus ones that are constrained. We find that those who are constrained pre-intervention, I'm used to presenting financial crisis papers, I guess, but pre-intervention, the ones that are constrained are able to reduce their late fees from borrowing considerably. So this kind of suggests that there may be some welfare improvement, if they were constrained and paying high fees and doing so, out of rational reasons, and we're completely happy to do so. I don't think we would find this reduction in late fee borrowing for the constrained group. At the same time, those who report high stress from debt are also the ones that are reducing their late fees the most. And, to be quite frank, I mean, I didn't report it here in these slides, but these individuals who are paying high fees and who are providing estimates of higher self-perceived stress are the ones that are the most, moving the most or the most active in the change in borrowing behavior from pre to post. So there's a couple of points I want to just talk about here. So, thinking about what might be kind of unique in a not so great way about our study is that subjects or consumers in general in China may be super different to those in Germany or Europe or the United States, right? They may, first of all, adhere differently to interventions. We have a couple of tests and things that we do to to kind of alleviate some of these concerns. So it could be that on one hand, Chinese subjects or students are more conforming or more following of authority. As researchers, if we come in and say this, they might be more likely to follow it compared to someone in a different university or in a different country. One way we do this is that we can look at not only university level variation, but also class level variation and teacher level variation. And the benefit here is that all of the instructors were basically from the Wuhan University of Science and Technology, where our co-author is situated. And then we worked with all these other schools. So if subjects were concerned that they had to kind of adhere to their own instructor potentially to get a good grade in a different class or for whatever reason, we should really find a differential effect between Wuhan students and Wuhan instructors compared to other students and the Wuhan instructors, because there's no kind of familiarity or no real authority between those two levels of matching. However, we find really consistent, strong results regardless of how we split up or look at the university level or classroom level variation. And if there's a concern that subjects are really just following the orders of the instructor, that's really not a concern, because instructors were very clearly taught to not teach a specific curriculum related to any goals or any normative features about online borrowing or lending or different types of credit products. And kind of in both treatments were kind of the educational aspects of borrowing and these borrowing products discussed. So we should find similar effects in the financial literacy treatment if subjects are really just trying to listen to instructors, but we do not. And then the question is, okay, so, and this kind of leads into the second discussion that hopefully we'll get through, is like, okay, so this is very nice and good, but what can we do from this? What can we learn from it? Can these types of interventions be done at any sort of scale? What is their cost effectiveness, and so on and so forth. And I think that is definitely an important area which we need to study. First of all, in our setting, the costs between financial education and self-control were identical. And in fact, we even used the same instructor. So that was kind of a non-issue, at least from a research perspective. So from a research perspective, the methods could easily be replicated or expanded on. In a more kind of realistic setting, can these be rolled out? Can we actually do something in the marketplace with them? Well, financial literacy courses, as I talked about, has been widely discussed as being integrated into normal curriculums. All we're saying here is that potentially in addition or instead of those, we could also test or also roll out segments related to individual budgeting and planning, some things that are less kind of, more self-control related. And in terms of also students potentially sharing data and using the app and kind of giving us financial information, the app is not necessarily a requirement. This kind of adds a lot of scale and cost effectiveness to the entire program, but in general, it could be done on paper and pen. And as I mentioned, the previous work of Oten and Cheng were always done on paper and pen. So that would require more of these in-person written and, kind of more traditional counseling sessions, but which has its own weaknesses and problems, but that could be an alternative in other countries or with other subject pools. So basically, from the first paper, the main takeaway is really that self-control training is more strongly linked to improved outcomes with online consumer credit and this is potentially because the sessions hone soft skills and salience towards decision-making in consumer debt. And this type of training may be an effective way to improve downstream borrowing behavior and potentially combined with financial literacy. The question is, what is the next iteration? What do we do with these learnings? So if there's any questions, then I just keep going, right? So the next kind of part of the chat, and this is really more of a little bit of a brainstorm in a sense. So the idea is, can a robo-advisor replace the self-control training program that we had in version 1? And kind of this paper is more titled, more relevant to the name of the talk, by self-control, robo-advice, and borrowing decisions. So thinking about some of the motivation, I mean, I just spent basically 45 minutes motivating it from our first paper, but actually robo-advice or anything kind of technology-driven in consumer credit management is actually, has a very scarce presence. And this is from Di Conto and Rossi's recent very nice survey paper, which I recommend everyone to read. It's called Frontiers in Robo-Advice, I think, something like that. I can follow up later. But basically, they document from across the literature that less sophisticated households and low-income households tend to be the ones who accumulate consumer debt. And this type of debt is very costly and typically substantial. And for most non-expert households is not fully understood, and at the same time, it's not transparent. Understanding it, even if you are an expert, takes substantial time and effort. It could be that this type of robo-advice, seldomly or rarely exists in this sector because of misaligned incentives between the kind of actors which are supplying this type of consumer credit and the potential demand side customers. No, it's no kind of it's no hidden secret or something that banks and institutions which provide these consumer credit products are earning kind of a lot of money from individuals' lack of transparency or lack of understanding this intransparent products. So, what we want to study in this paper is, we know from study 1 that self-control interventions can calm impulsive spending and borrowing behavior. The question is, can a self-control intervention be delegated to an app or to a robo-advisor? The hypothesis is essentially that much of the benefits from the existing self-control and self-regulation treatments come from individual factors which could be replicated without a human counselor and an advisor. So in our past treatment, basically we have the same instructor doing financial literacy topics as they are doing the self-control training. So the idea is, it's really just the curriculum and just the kind of guiding of these subjects, not really a human touch that's provided, that's causing the effect. So what we're planning, again, is another longitudinal field study where we allocate individuals to an in-person financial literacy and self-control training program, which would combine most likely elements from both settings that I discussed previously. And secondly, an app version of the program, and then compare both of these to a control group. What we would do here is argue that the participation in this study in general would require the use of a personal financial management tool for us to access spending, borrowing, savings, right? This time, we would also require, in a sense, that the control group also provides us data. And we have to think about this a little bit to make sure that we can be smart about that and alleviate any current concerns about selection into the program. However, this is actually not such a huge problem in China. The first is because, it will be something like more than 90% of the subjects that come into to even participate will already have such a tool on their applications, right? And then we're going to pay a participation fee. So what we can do is study basically the willingness to pay of subjects in order to give us that data, which I think is on its own an interesting contribution. And importantly, these PFMs would give us basically data in 6-month blocks of spending and borrowing behavior. So what you see here is it's not the greatest screenshot from the app that we are planning to use, which is in our sense, our robo-advisor. I'm going to say robo-advisors in quotes because it's not perfect either, but I think what it will do is give us at least the first steps into this topic. So basically what you see here is some sort of personal financial management tool which tracks your spending across different categories and also gives you different the ability to make different goals linked to spending behavior. So whatever this actual goal is, but it's some sort of spending goal related to some sort of spending topic. Some important aspects of our setting here. So again, we'll have this panel dimension, and that'll allow us to control for individual specific factors such as financial literacy and different behavioral preferences. The treatments itself will also hold constant informational content provided through the intervention, so we can do that. And that will allow us to characterize the relative costs and benefits between the two treatments, right? So the robo version of the treatment and the in-person version of the treatment. And this, as far as I know, is kind of is missing from the literature, but it seems to me is one of the most fundamental questions on robo-advice. I mean, of course, our robo-advice is not equivalent to what everyone thinks of when you hear robo-advice, but essentially what we are doing is mitigating the counseling side of a self-control treatment to technology. So in that case, it is in a sense robo-advice. So basically, here is our latest headache. So, but also it's not so bad, right? So sometimes policy can prohibit research plans. So just recently, so this was April 7th, China basically banned the use of these online loans to students. I'll argue that it was a direct result of our working paper, but potentially not. But that's okay. So that's a good thing in general. Maybe it's not the best thing if it's banned, but anyway. So there's two things here. One thing is we can maybe use this as a shock to examine what happened to students over the last couple of months. But on the other hand, we decided that we would use a non-student sample to study these questions, and we've started to partner with different manufacturing firms to allow us to study young adult factory workers, basically. And this is actually quite nice because these young adults who are factory workers are potentially more of an interesting group than students. So these employees face binding financial constraints. They're generally paid a relatively low wage. They are the same age as students. They are just educated differently, right? It may not be optimal for them to borrow in terms of smoothing because they don't necessarily have a high expected income in the future. In our Chinese setting, there are cases where they live in arrangements which are similar to university dorms, which allows us some very interesting ways to do the sampling and also tells us something about peer effects, which we study also in our first paper, which I didn't really talk about. And this is, in general, kind of a low income, low financial literacy group, which could actually benefit significantly from interventions. So what we're doing currently is, we've currently partnered with 2 firms in a large industrial park in a specific province in China, where we have these relationships, and we are most likely going to be able to partner with another 2 to 3 different firms in the same industrial park. One is an electric bike manufacturing company. The average age of 600 workers is 25 years old. The other is a food manufacturing company with about 400 workers and an average age of also under 30. What's nice about this is the firms can also provide us administrative data such as attendance, productivity, payroll, and so on and so forth. The benefit here is you can really do some interesting control. We can control for changes in income and changes in wealth, whereas with students, we don't have the best data on if their families are wealthy or if they're working a second job and so on and so forth. But for workers, we would be able to know that. So our plan is basically a pre-treatment survey, which includes behavioral questions as well as questions on borrowing habits and constraints. Similar, how many times, how often have you used online borrowing? Again, at this stage, we will make an agreement for data sharing, and we will get access to their personal financial management data. We will have a much shorter treatment period this time, so probably just a couple of months. This is also with employees, so we're a little bit constrained. We can't just constantly bombard employees with different tasks and bring them into different treatment sessions and so on. But probably we'll have, let's say, 2 treatments in person for the in-person group. And post-treatment, we'll have an exit survey and kind of observe their personal financial management data as well. So, the first treatment is let's say the robo treatment. Basically, on the app that we're considering to use, we can set up different budgets and for different categories of spending. We can notify users to pay bills and when and where to not exceed planned budgets. Users can make savings plans for specific items or for specific topics or whatever. And all of that information is archived and can be exported and so on and so forth. All of the functionality is there, but what the app obviously does not do is kind of force people to set it up and actually use it. So that will be basically the nature of our intervention with the treatment. So anyone who's part of the robo treatment will get the app, and they will be kind of required to set up some sort of budget for the next month, and then obviously give us that data in that time after. We're also thinking about the idea to additionally implement some sort of log keeping or journal or something like this online, where they can write down how they may deviate for their plans or how they felt about it if they did indeed deviate from their plans. So for example, if I plan for the next month to not go to the pub or to not make any spontaneous consumption, but then I do, then I would be asked to kind of write down how I felt about this and if I felt it was a good idea or a bad idea and so on and so forth. This was a factor from our first treatment. So we're thinking about bringing this back in this treatment. Even if it doesn't exist currently in this app, it's something that's easily done and something that could be automated quite easily. Basically, the self-control in-person treatment would then specifically replicate the things that we want to do in the robo treatment, but bring them in person, basically. And they would use a PFM function of another app just to give us the data. So this is not like with planning and so on and so forth. It's just purely in person and using the PFM specifically for the specific purchases and borrowing amounts to be tracked. Some other ideas which we're kind of thinking about asking and so on in the two surveys are basically to understand any qualitative reasons around borrowing plans. This is kind of related to our log setting. Understand different types of credit products, so what they may or may not use, or what their opinions of what different credit products are. I think what we're planning to do is vary different things like participation fees and show-up fees to understand what individuals' willingness to share data is, and elicit these values for privacy, how individuals understand or feel about what firms use data for, in general, what their trust levels are in technology and financial technology. But that's basically where we're at with the second one. Basically, we had hoped initially that we would be in market in April. That's not going to happen, but potentially by the end of May or something, we will be finalizing our study protocol. So that's my talk today. And if you have time now, I would love to hear if you have any questions or comments or even suggestions for basically the second half of the project.